you saw, but today PlayStation came out, Sony came out and said, hey, PlayStation prices up 11%. A good example of in my opinion, just normal stuff we all know about having a significant price increase, and largely because of tariffs.
The opinions expressed in this program are for general informational purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual or on any specific security. It is only intended to provide education about the financial industry. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult your financial advisor prior to investing. Any past performance discussed during this program is no guarantee of future results. Any indices referenced for comparison are unmanaged and cannot be invested into directly. Any references to performance of securities are thought to be materially accurate, and actual performance may differ. As always, please remember investing involves risk and possible loss of principal capital. Please seek advice from a licensed professional.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Daily Dots. Chase here, flying solo with you today on Tuesday, August 20th. Make that Wednesday, August 20th. Week's flying. I'm going to go through the markets. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Friday, Jay Powell, what the Fed's kind of looking at for the next meeting in September, and then a couple other just odds and ends caught my eye today. Markets were sort of volatile intraday, but kind of close to close, not that big a deal. But S&P closed the day down 0.24 after being a little worse off than that at one point during the day. Same with NASDAQ 100 down 0.59. But, we were down over 1 at one point, really close now to, we had basically built a short-term uptrend line going back to May 23rd. And you're like, you dip below it and then you kind of come back up to the bottom of it all just within the day. So it's going to kind of make for an interesting Thursday. And then of course, Friday, small caps down 0.35, equal weight down 0.09, and another day of equal weight beating Mag 7 though, with Mag 7 down 1.1, all world ex-US up 1.6, or 0.16, decent outperformance from the rest of the world. And that was with a little bit of help from the dollar being down 0.09, 0.05. So mostly flat on the dollar though. Bitcoin, gold, silver kind of picked back up today, more so for gold and silver really than Bitcoin. Oil was up 1.7, so back close to $63 on oil, still low, but not terrible. As far as yields went, you were pretty flat on the front end, but down about 1-2 basis points out on the 30-year. And then vol, you were at one point up, I think 3 or 4% maybe for vol, something like that, but you ended up closing down a little less than 1%, 0.39, but notable compression given where you were at least at one point during the day. So front month vol now 18.3. You kind of went up and hit the 50-day moving average for front month fixed futures and then kind of petered out there. I still maintain that, and we're very close to negative gamma. We're above it. It looks like you're kind of in that neutral range where it's kind of weird to even call it positive or negative. But if you have a big down move tomorrow, then you're in negative gamma. I shouldn't even say big, like a decent down move tomorrow, you're in negative gamma. And then Friday, of course, if you get something unkind from the Fed chair, then you probably end up down and firmly in negative gamma where it can feed on itself. And of course, one of my focuses has been, if you go low enough, then you get vol to spike enough, then you end up with the situation where vol control funds have to start selling and CTAs have to start selling. And that's when you can just, for no reason at all, essentially get like a 10% correction, other than mechanical people have to get out and follow their own rules. And that's really it. With that said, you could argue there's some real reasons to sell too, of course. One of the things I want to talk about, so the Fed minutes came out for the last meeting today, and they read hawkish, but I'm not taking too much solace in that, even though I expect more hawkish than other people expect Fed for the next few months, just because it was before the jobs print and the inflation print. So, it wasn't crazy to be more worried about inflation than as clearly most of the community was. Since that jobs report, I think we've gone from 2 doves to people like truly looking for a cut to more than that. I don't know if it's 3, 4, 5, 6, but it's clearly more than just those 2 got shook by the jobs report. At the same time, all the people worried about inflation can point to like, well, look at this CPI and PPI. Like core PCE is going to be 2.9%. Like that's 0.9 above target. So in that from that standpoint, like both sides still have something to kind of point at, and they're not wrong when they do so. So really, the argument just got more intense. So I don't think enough people got converted to being super worried about jobs to really make a big enough difference to do. Maybe they do the September cut, but really that's going to come down to we get another jobs print, we get another inflation print, and that jobs print, if it's not bad, let's say the unemployment rate stays at 4.2 or lower, maybe even 4.3 if it's decent, it, and the next inflation print is warm again, then it just makes it really, really tough to cut in September. Forget, after that. And we still have September rate cut priced at an 83% chance. Now you came from over 100, but still 83 is more or less priced in. So if Powell in any way, leaves some doubt going into the meeting, and leaves it like maybe a live meeting, but not a sold meeting by any stretch, and expresses some concerns about the inflation print we just got, and then the market, I really think, has to pull that back down to 50-50-ish, or even worse potentially. And something to note here is, the last time the Fed had their big, benchmark review of their whole strategy, and they basically came up with a new one called flexible average inflation targeting, to basically say, look, we've been running so far below target that wouldn't it make sense to just let it run above target for a little while to kind of catch it up? The problem with that framework moving forward, and they may well get away from that, is you've essentially caught up now. So now that you've caught up on your framework, like under running of inflation, and you've been well above target for 5 years in a row, like how do you justify, how do you it makes it harder to justify letting inflation run hot moving forward, since you already let it do the catch up that a lot of people thought was a bad idea to begin with. And as far as like, I look back at a lot of this data today to kind of get a feel for, all right, it's so easy to get lost in the sauce and in the details of like month to month data getting released. I decided to zoom out and look at like a 20-year average for the unemployment rate and 20-year average for all the kind of major inflation metrics to see where are we compared to like history here. And as far as the unemployment rate, the 20-year average for the unemployment rate is 5.9%, and we're at 4.2. So we are an entire 1.7% below the 20-year average. Now, I think it's worth mentioning the estimates for kind of that break even on that, for where you can tilt into a recession to the downside or tilt into inflation on the upside, is lower than it was in that 20-year average. So that full 1.7% spread is not all, just chalk it up to the great, jobs market. Some of that's, it's just naturally that way. But still, 1.7%, I don't think you can explain all that with just the natural rate of unemployment. And then on the inflation side, the 20-year average for core inflation is 2.5, and we're at 3.1. The 20-year average for core PCE is 2.15, and we are currently at 2.9, or about to be at 2.9. The median inflation print, the 20-year average, 2.9, you're at 3.6. And then the trimmed mean, which is kind of my favorite, the 20-year average is 2.6, and you're currently at 3.2. So looking from a very zoomed out historical lens, you have unemployment way better than the last 20 years, and you have inflation way worse than the last 20 years. So to me, if it's kind of a 50-50 jump ball between should we care more about inflation or should we care more about jobs, given that one's way better than history and one's way worse than history, to me, if I was on the committee, I would be like, look, we got to, especially with tariffs just now being felt in inflation prints, I think we got to defend that. We've been running above our target for 5 years in a row by a lot. Unemployment, sure, it's picked up a little bit, but it's deeply below not just the 20-year average, but the 10-year average, the 30-year average. Like, it's fine. And now, yeah, of course, hiring's come down, but that's because there's less people to even get hired given where net immigration is. So the break even number you need at each month to not have a recession, it may have gone from 80 to 20,000 or something in the last 2 years. Um, so it's easy to like anchor to like, oh, 100,000 jobs every month. Like if we go below that, we have a problem. Well, no, not really. So many people have left the labor force that 20 may be the same as 100 was in 2023 or 200 even. So my zoomed out view of that is if you want to be honest about inflation, I'm not suggesting they do. My personal view is that 3% is more like their target than 2. The problem with that even though is like, you know, core CPI, super core CPI, median, trimmed mean, and soon to be probably core PCE, all running at 3 or higher, and they're they're picking back up, they're hooking back up and picking up over on like a 1 month annualized, 2 month annualized, 3 month annualized. They're all kind of higher than kind of 5 6 month annualized. So like this stuff's turning itself back higher. And in my view, because of the inflationary impulse we're going to get from tariffs, like it's just not going to get better soon. And along those lines, I don't know if you saw, but today PlayStation came out, Sony came out and said, hey, PlayStation prices up 11%. A good example of, in my opinion, just normal stuff we all know about having a significant price increase, and largely because of tariffs. And that's going to get measured. Will people buy less Starbucks to pay for a PlayStation? Sure. I'm not saying it's going to like crush the economy necessarily, and I'm not even saying it will lead to 9% inflation like we used to have, but it might lead to 4, and that alone is a big enough problem for many things. So using that zoomed out metric, to me, it would make sense for them to not tempt the inflation expectation genie from getting out of the bottle, which they showed they were concerned in these previous minutes. I would think that's not getting much better. Now, I do think you need another hot print or two, because they've been good until this last one. It's just that it shouldn't even really be hitting in size yet. Like the fact that we did have that really hot PPI, I don't think it'd be that hot every month by any stretch. But do I think year over year PPI and CPI are going to go down from here? I just don't, especially not in a meaningful way. I think they can keep inching higher. I think goods inflation can keep moving higher.
The opinions expressed in this program are for general informational purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual or on any specific security. Any references to performance of securities are thought to be materially accurate, and actual performance may differ.
And one last point I'll make on that. I was on Dimitri Kofinas, who does Hidden Forces, has his Genius community, which I'm a member of. Zach's a member of. He does Q&As with people on there to be a benefit to the members. And I did the Q&A today. And every once in a while, you kind of connect dots in your head, not while writing or thinking or going for a walk or something, but like in the middle of talking about something. It's rare, but every once in a while it happens to me. And that happened to me today, talking about tariffs. And I'm sure there's a cohort of listeners pretty tired of me ranting about tariffs, and I respect that. But I just think they're a bigger deal than other people, and it's hard for me to let go of because of that. A couple things that I talked about today, and something I heard from Doug Irwin, who wrote literally all the books in the stack behind me for those watching the video. Basically, the foremost trade expert in America. I listened to a show with him where he mentioned something, and that kind of helped bring me along in the way that I was viewing some other things. And basically, his point was that, one of the problems that these heavy trade barriers end up, especially blanket style, just this whole country, this is your rate, instead of like just targeting certain products, is you end up making your exports less competitive, from just a pure price standpoint. So like cars are a good example, where if you want to sell more cars to the rest of the world, the way to do that is to have them be of higher quality and lower price. That's sort of economics 101, obviously. The problem is if you have really big tariffs on car parts and steel and aluminum and glass and rubber and like all the inputs that end up going into a car, not to mention maybe the machinery and some of the electronics and yada yada yada. If you make all that stuff a little bit more expensive, or in some cases a lot more expensive, the price of the car at the end is higher, obviously, which has its own domestic ramifications we all know about. That's what we're all arguing about all the time in the public square right now, about how inflationary and how problematic these are. But what's getting kind of lost in this debate is how does GM, after having to raise the prices on their cars because of those input prices going higher, how do they compete to export their cars to other countries, which we want to do? Like, we're trying to get the trade deficit down. Part of that is to export more. But if you make most of your exports cost more, they get by definition less competitive. So in a interesting way, like the thing you're trying to improve, which is your export market, gets hampered by the very protection you put up, because you just make it more expensive, and then by definition less competitive. And that brings me to the most important point I want to make on this, that I talked about in Dimitri's Q&A, and that was competitiveness in general. Like, because I got some great questions from that community about, like, okay, but like, well, then what would you do to like help fix, some of these problems that are real problems? And I've, on this show many times, Zach and I've kind of debated it, kind of discussed it, how you even look at it, made the points that, yeah, like some of these really strategic sectors that are crucial have to be supported in some way. Like, you have to have a system that makes sure that, medicine production doesn't go to zero inside of America, or that steel production doesn't go to zero inside of America. Like, I would never argue against any of that. It's just, what has to happen though is you can't make your production of things less competitive. If you build up such big walls to competition that your domestic producers can get that fat, dumb, and happy on quality and price, where they can't compete globally anymore. And don't get me wrong, we've already lost a lot of competitiveness there. You just run into problems. And I think, very targeted and very, kind of sunset provisioned and very targeted support, whether that be price guarantees on, like, for example, MP materials. I don't really love the equity stake maybe that the U.S. government took in that. I shouldn't say maybe. I don't really like the equity stake. The more I think about that, the more I was like, no, like, but saying we will buy all of your offtake above like a normal market price, kind of like give you a quota, like you give the government X amount, we will pay you Y. We'll make it worth your time to put in the investment and everything. To me, like, that makes sense. And if they needed, some sort of tax incentive layered in, and maybe, a very targeted, very specific, maybe even defined by time tariff to help them get up to speed, like, that makes sense. But to say, like, to think of it as like, we're going to make most things more expensive for a long period of time to protect you from competing against the best in the world at whatever that is, that's where the mistake comes in to me. So to me, I think the first principle you have to start with anytime you're thinking about how do we fix like domestic manufacturing problems, especially for obviously like, vital things to national security and national well-being. You have to start with just like a first principle, like everything we do here, at least medium term, cannot take away from our competitiveness. Because if it does, if you just have a giant, swollen, uncompetitive manufacturing sector, then 25 years from now, all of a sudden you look around and like you can't really export anything because no one wants your stuff, because it's not as good, it's too expensive. Sure, like you can sell it in America, but then literally it's all just a recipe for your standard of living, your quality of living to go down. Now everyone might have a job at the plant, and you might view that as a good enough outcome, but to me, income per person and things like that matter. And if you look at, essentially socialist places where the government controls the means of production, has a significant thumb on the scale of imports and exports, and you have to get a license to do imports, you have to get a license to do exports, you have to pay an import tax or an export tax on all these different things, just basically top down managed, not bottom up managed, kind of just ancient socialism versus capitalism kind of view of this, you get left with an eroding economy, like where people's standard of living and quality of life tend to melt lower. It's not like an overnight thing; it just kind of slowly happens. And trying to be good at everything, trying to produce everything for yourself, the autarky as it's called. That's kind of North Korea, Venezuela, Peronist Argentina atmosphere that you end up in. And I, like to think that's not where anyone's trying to take us. Obviously, like in fact, the people largely in power in DC have made a career out of criticizing that kind of stuff. So I hope to see some reforms, some 180s on some of this stuff, some targeted peeling back of some of these rules and measures that, in my view, at least go too far and are too detrimental to domestic production, to our ability to compete, to our ability to export. The short-term impacts of this stuff, it's not that big a deal. Like jobs and inflation in October of 2025 is not going to be catastrophic because of these tariffs where they're at the moment. But, America's growth, America's per capita GDP in 2040 could be a vastly different outcome if we just froze everything we're doing right now into place versus found just more thoughtful and targeted ways that still emphasize being competitive moving forward. But enough of my millionth soapbox on tariffs for today. That's it for today. We'll be back again tomorrow. 2 more of these to go for the week. The big one on Friday after Trump's. That's fun. Powell's Jackson Hole speech. That'll be the big one. We'll see how it goes. I'm totally open to him being really dovish, really hawkish, and obviously him trying to go as right down the middle as he can. But as I said earlier, I think the next inflation report and jobs report are going to carry a lot more weight on what they do than the speech. I just have concerns for the market being a little fragile as it's constructed on a mechanical basis going into Friday. But that's it for me. Back again tomorrow. Don't forget you can download, subscribe, knowyourriskpodcast.com. Check us out on YouTube and everywhere else in social media. Talk to you tomorrow. Cheers.
Investment advice cannot be given without a client service agreement. Zach Abraham is an investment advisor representative of Trek Financial, an SEC registered investment advisor. Bulwark Capital Management is a marketing name only and does not carry a separate registration.